is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Robin Dwyer. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. US President Joe Biden pushes for more oil output from Gulf leaders in Jeddah, but he's criticised for meeting Saudi Prince Salman. Wildfires rage across Europe, and the UK has warned that lives are in danger as the country braces for the hottest temperatures in its history. And Sri Lanka begins the process of electing a new president. The former leader says he did all he could to avert the economic crisis. US President Joe Biden is meeting Arab leaders in Saudi Arabia, hoping to persuade them to boost oil output. He also wants to encourage more acceptance of Israel among Arab nations and form what the White House calls a new axis driven by shared concerns over Iran. The second day of the Gulf Cooperation Council summit in Jeddah is focusing on energy, food security and defence. It's been overshadowed by Biden's meeting with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who the United States accuses of ordering the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. Well, our correspondent Jim Stenman is in Dubai. So, Jim, one of the main reasons for Biden's visit was to try and persuade Arab nations to pump more oil. Do you think he's likely to get what he wants?
It seems like it might be moving in that direction, but at a very, very slow pace. Yesterday, as you know, Biden welcomed the previously agreed oil production increases by OPEC+, which of course includes the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Russia, and so those increases are going to be 50% above what was initially planned for July and August. Biden is hoping for more gradual increases, but the Saudis, they insist that this is only going to happen on a demand basis. The argument among producers here in the Gulf is that there's not a massive gap when it comes to supply at the moment, that it's simply a case of Russian oil being redirected to, indeed, China and India. So in the eyes of OPEC, there is no oil shortage. That's the short answer. OPEC producers, they will meet again in August when Saudi Arabia and other members could discuss additional changes to production quotas. Further increases, if they happen, will be very, very gradual and certainly still help Americans who are hurting at the gas pump, but it's not likely to have a major overnight impact as Biden probably would have hoped.
And another objective is a new regional axis to deal with Iran. Has there been any progress on that?
Right. So this is something that Biden has been working on quite intensely since he re-entered the White House, but it has proven tricky so far. Some are saying that the Iranians are making difficult demands that are delaying the renegotiation of or the reviving of the Iran nuclear deal, rather, I should say. There is a sense that any real and meaningful renegotiated Iran deal must also include the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which obviously has huge influence in the region. And this in of itself essentially offers an opportunity to extend the Abraham Accords, the Trump-era agreement that essentially saw the UAE normalize its relationship with Israel, and a lot of other Arab countries followed. So Saudi Arabia shares Israel's concerns over Iran's nuclear program and regional proxies. So there is the possibility here that Biden could perhaps over time extend the Abraham Accords, and that could be one way to essentially produce a renegotiated, a revived Iran nuclear deal, but things are happening at a very, very slow pace when it comes to that.
And the defining image of this visit has been of Joe Biden fist-bumping with Crown Prince bin Salman, and that's caused unhappiness in Washington and elsewhere, hasn't it?
Absolutely. This visit is seen as controversial after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, which, of course, we have to stress the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, denies. Biden did greet MBS with a fist bump. Now, this is quite a contrast to his campaign pledge to make Saudi Arabia a pariah on the world stage. That fist bump, as you say, it's been criticized, including by U.S. media, but also Democrats at home, as well as Republicans in D.C. Khashoggi's fiancé did write a piece in the Washington Post saying that the international community has to bring the killers of her fiancé's killers to justice. But I think what's worth remembering in all of this is that from a U.S. standpoint, this visit was necessary, really, in order to possibly bring down oil prices ahead of the midterms. Biden is struggling with his popularity at home, so any movement when it comes to oil markets could potentially put him in a better position when it comes to those crucial midterms.
Jim, thank you very much. Our correspondent Jim Stenman in Dubai. Sri Lanka's ousted president says he did everything possible to avert the economic crisis that's hit the country. Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled overseas after months of protests over rampant inflation led to a popular uprising. Parliament has now begun the process of electing a new president, with a vote set to take place next week. Our correspondent Ravinder Bawa reports.
As soon as he took charge as the interim president, Ranil Wickremesinghe committed to protect democracy and act according to the constitution. One clear message in his address to the nation was that law and order has to be restored for the country to come out of the economic crisis.
I will never allow any unconstitutional action or facilitate it. I will never work outside the constitution. If law and order collapses, it will hurt our economy. The supply of fuel, oil, water supply and food can collapse.
Anti-government protests triggered by the worst economic crisis have led to this change in the political system. The demonstrators, who have been on the streets for more than 3 months, breathed a sigh of relief with this news.
We have won the battle of sending Gotabaya Rajapaksa home, but our war was sending Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Ranil Wickremesinghe. So we will win the final battle of sending Ranil Wickremesinghe, and we will win the entire war as well.
We're not so happy about that, because I think one of the major demands of the protest was that Ranil Wickremesinghe and Gotabaya Rajapaksa both vacate their positions, because the way Ranil came into parliament is not democratic. That is not what we believe as Sri Lankan.
I need a new president, good economy knowledge guy we need, that's it.
Even though there is jubilation, hardships of Sri Lankans are far from over. Serpentine queues for essentials are a reality that the country will have to deal with for a long time. And by 20th July, the country will have a new president. But the mammoth task before the interim government would be to put the economy back on track. Ravinder Bawa, CGTN, Colombo.
3 people have been killed and 15 injured in a Russian strike on an industrial plant in the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. The region's governor says the factory made components for spacecraft, rockets and satellites, including one launched by Elon Musk's SpaceX company. Russia's defense ministry says it was targeted because it was making Ukrainian ballistic missiles. 5 other people were killed in a series of Russian shellings around Dnipro and close to the city of Kharkiv. Mexico's Navy has arrested a drug lord convicted of murdering a U.S. anti-narcotics agent in the 1980s. Rafael Caro Quintero was captured in a remote corner of the country after a search dog found him hiding in a bush. 14 military personnel were killed when a helicopter used in the arrest mission crashed as it tried to land. The United States farming industry depends heavily on migrant workers, particularly from Latin America, to get harvests to market. But that reliance can lead to abuse from human traffickers and cases of modern-day slavery. Our correspondent Alistair Baverstock reports.
Georgia peaches, a symbol of this southern US state, but producing them is hard work. Pruning, harvesting, sorting and packing is still done by hand, and most of the labour force comes from Latin America. A long-established producer in the state, Dickey Farms finds labour through the H-2A Temporary Agricultural Worker Visa program.
So for over 25 years we've been in the program.
It is, a rigorous process, but it is, legal way. But not all local farms go through the official route. One federal indictment unsealed last year revealed a years-long case of modern-day slavery taking place here in the state of Georgia. Investigators say migrants trafficked from Mexico and Central America were held in dirty camps, fed very little and paid a pittance to work the fields at gunpoint. At least 2 of the victims of the scheme died. The discovery of human trafficking so close to home was a shock for Georgia's upstanding farmers. It's worrisome because it looks bad on all of agriculture, not just necessarily one subset or one industry within agriculture, and especially when folks are working really hard to do it legally. And Belisa Urbina runs Ser Familia, a leading non-profit organisation in Georgia offering counselling and other mental health services to migrants. She says the psychological impact on victims can be devastating.
And through the years, we have seen a lot of people that come here lured or actually physically brought here in order to work, many times on jobs that other people do not want to do. They can develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, severe anxiety. How did this happen to me? How was I so naive?
It's a topic that farmers say needs careful attention, especially since American farms depend so heavily on migrant labour. Without these workers, production would grind to a halt. It's very important that there's a good source of seasonal labor, but it needs to be done the right way. It needs to be done legally, safely. They're working on it, but that's all. That's all you could do. Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Macon, Georgia.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Warnings of a danger to life. The UK government holds emergency talks with temperatures set to hit 40 degrees in the next few days.
What I show of China is what I really experience in China, and it's very different to what people in the West experience in China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
I think it's fantastically important to educate British people about Chinese history and culture.
We have sown seeds which in China have grown to very big trees.
The values of horsemanship, respect, responsibility, compassion can be extended to all relationships.
My name is Max. I'm a food blogger. I grew up in China. Now I live in the UK.
We deserve respect, and the Chinese people with their own culture also deserve respect.
For cross-cultural understanding, I think food is a really good place to start. I hope to spread awareness of all the different cultures within China. I think there's a lot to share.
To increase understanding between cultures, I think time and patience is of course important, but the most important thing is responsibility.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
Welcome back. A reminder of our headlines. US President Joe Biden pushes for more oil output from Gulf leaders in Jeddah, but he's criticised for meeting Saudi Prince Salman. And Sri Lanka begins the process of electing a new president. Former leader says he did all he could to avert the economic crisis. The UK government is holding an emergency meeting as forecasters warn of temperatures hitting a record 40 degrees Celsius in the next few days. A first ever national heatwave emergency has been declared with warnings of danger to life. Rail passengers are being told to avoid unnecessary travel, and some schools will close. Well, our correspondent Andrew Wilson is following this story. So, Andrew, what can we expect from this emergency meeting?
Well, I think it's time for government to sit down and make sure they've got all their bases covered, because the warnings coming from the Met Office and the UK Health Security Agency are that this is an unprecedented event. It's going to be more serious than anything the UK has experienced so far to date. The Met Office often issues red warnings for wind and for rain, but it's never done it for heat anymore. And the warning is that thousands may die as a result of this 2 to 3 days of extreme weather that we're facing at the beginning of next week. Now, last year, conditions weren't nearly as serious. No records were broken. There weren't any really serious heat waves, and yet the health services estimate that 1,600 people, 1,600 excess deaths occurred because of hot weather from last year. This time round, this could be much more severe. So ministers will want to know that there's a plan for schools should the weather get too hot. None of our schools are purpose-built to resist hot weather. A lot of them have glass roofs in certain parts of the buildings. They want to know that the railway lines are fit for purpose, that there are plans in case there's problems with those, that there are plans in case there's problems with the roads, and particularly, of course, healthcare. They'll want to know not just if accident and emergency can cope with an extra influx of inquiries or even with patients, but also that the health system in its entirety can cope. General practitioners, doctors on call, healthcare centres, care homes, if all these are ready now and have the appropriate instructions or appropriate preparations to deal with this weather that's coming the way of the UK. They'll want to know all this, and that's the centralised way of doing it, through one of these COBRA meetings. Information sharing from the experts, from the departments.
And Andrew, the UK is much more used to colder temperatures than this, isn't it? It's just not built to withstand these kind of hot temperatures.
Well, one swift walk around any British city and you'll know that this is a country that was designed for hundreds of years for a completely different type of climate. The difference between cities around the Mediterranean and the cities in Northern Europe is stark when it comes to preparations for the kind of weather that we're now looking at. European cities around the Mediterranean have fountains, they have green spaces, the use of shade is completely different. Architects build buildings to resist high temperatures and resist sunlight coming through windows and all the rest of it, whereas the UK is far more vulnerable to this kind of weather. But it's also cultural as well. British people tend to go out when it's sunny rather than stay indoors. They tend to take their shirts off when it gets sunny rather than cover up. They tend to head to the coast, to go to the beach. Now, everyone goes to the beach, but there's all sorts of systematic practices that people are used to in the Mediterranean that they're not so used to in the UK, in terms of protection of skin, in terms of how long one stays in the sunshine, in terms of being hydrated, which is why we're seeing all these public services messages being circulated at the moment, which would sound very, very obvious to someone who lives in Spain or in Greece, advising people to keep the doors closed during the day, to open the windows at night when the air is cooler, to keep hydration, to stay out of the sunlight, to leave your pets in cars. All this advice is now being circulated because we're simply not used to these kind of conditions. It's a cultural change, and it's one that ministers in this COBRA meeting know, at least in the back of their minds, even if they're not talking about it in any detail yet, that we're going to have to get used to, because it's not going anywhere different, anywhere fast.
Andrew, thanks very much. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson. Wildfires in France, Spain and Portugal are putting firefighters under pressure. Extremely high temperatures combined with drought and tinder-dry conditions are making the situation worse. Our correspondent, Rahul Pathak, reports.
Wildfires continue to cause havoc, with Europe in the grip of another summer heat wave. In southwestern France, the worst-hit region was Bordeaux. Over 600 firefighters worked tirelessly to try and bring the forest fire under control, but said the effort would take days. Nearly 6,500 people had to be evacuated from the area, with no casualties being reported so far. The mix of high temperatures and winds looks set to continue until early next week, making life harder for the emergency services to battle against the huge blaze. But continued support from France's neighbours is helping the country deal with this reoccurring problem.
We're able to receive European support through a system that we put in place and help promote. We started last year by being there to support some countries such as Greece, and now this has become beneficial to us. I'd especially like to thank Greece, which has made specialised equipment available to us.
In Spain's Costa del Sol, soaring temperatures have contributed to a huge forest fire in the Mijas mountain range close to Malaga. Andalusian firefighters managed to bring it under control, but had to evacuate thousands of people from their homes. Dozens of different fires were reported, all burning simultaneously. It's a serious issue that's a result of the changing climate in Europe.
The
main reason for wildfires are the atmospheric conditions we've been suffering for a while now, conditions that we are experiencing right now. In the peninsula, we have a chronic drought that just gets worse year after year. We have less water. Rainfall in Spain and Portugal is now less common throughout the year. So we can conclude that it is the climatic conditions, dryness and extreme heat, which are the key factors that make these wildfires so serious.
Portugal was also badly hit this week. The government has issued its highest red alert warning across the country as thousands of firefighters battled fires burning across 2,000 hectares, which injured at least 30 people. Now, there's genuine concern about the strength and scale of these wildfires that have swept across southern Europe in 2022. There's a real sense of helplessness and inevitability, and scientists say that if rapid action is not taken on climate change, then it's something that we're going to have to live with and accept year on year. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
Firefighters in Greece are also battling more than 100 wildfires across the country, with the biggest on the island of Crete. People living southeast of Athens have been told to evacuate their homes as fires approach. Strong winds expected to continue into next week are hampering efforts to bring the flames under control. Well, our correspondent Evangelo Sipsas is in Athens. Evangelo, the biggest fire right now is in Crete. How are efforts to tackle it going?
Well, things right now are quite difficult on the island of Crete from the fire that broke out last night. Because of the strong winds, there's been a resurgence on parts of the southern part of the island, with making the levels of difficulty much more hard for the people that are battling it. Parts of the southern part of the island of Rethymno, the third largest city of Crete, were forced to evacuate. A number of municipalities were forced to evacuate as the fire continues to blow. As you can see behind me, the wind is continuing to pick up, and it's even more on Crete. Right now, there's a number of firefighters that are battling. More than 150 of them are battling the fires, and a number of trucks with airplanes and helicopters. But it's very difficult because the wind that is picking up, it's coming from the north part of the island with a lot of force. It is surrounding different municipalities, and just a few moments ago we saw there was an update that there was evacuation of a tourist resort on the southern part called Agios Vasilios, known for its luxury apartments. The mayor declared a state of emergency, took all the tourists to safety. There have been no reports of any injuries, but there have been reports of damages on the buildings. But that is not the only fire that broke out in the country. Over the last 24 hours, there were more than 100 fires in Greece, with the one that you mentioned earlier here in southern south part of the Greek capital of Athens, people being evacuated, and a number of fires that are still raging in the Peloponnese region. Most of them are under control with firefighters on the scene and helicopters and planes, but there is one outside of the city of Patra which is not under control. They're battling. More than 100 firefighters on the scene try to contain it, but it still remains out of control. And this is, according to the Ministry of Civil Protection, the worst is yet to come because the temperatures are expected to rise. Currently, we're talking about 34 to 35 degrees, but in the next 10 days, it's going to climb into the 40s with low humidity levels and high winds that could reach up to 120 kilometers an hour. The Civil Protection is encouraging people to stay indoors during the day and to avoid any unnecessary travel, any gatherings in parks or foresty areas.
Evangelo, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Evangelo Sipsas in Athens. Nigel Arnold is a professor of climate change science at the University of Reading. He says the record temperatures seen in many parts of the world are directly linked to greenhouse gas emissions.
Over the last 30 years or so, the global average temperature is about 1 degree higher than we saw in the middle of the 19th century. And in Reading, it's about 1 degree higher than it was just 30 years ago. So the temperatures are increasing, and the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published last year, was really hard-hitting. It said it was unequivocal that the increase in temperature was due to the human emissions of greenhouse gases through the burning of fossil fuels. So it's entirely down to that.
And many parts of the world, including the UK, are just not set up to deal with these temperatures. How is the heat changing our everyday lives?
Well, in most places, they're set up to cope with the conditions that they're used to. And that's inevitably going to be the case. Nowhere is going to be completely safe against any weather extreme. But what we're seeing is an increased number of extremes. And what's happening in practice is that I think people's healths are being affected, people's livelihoods are being affected, our ability to work is affected. But perhaps more importantly and more widespread, the services and infrastructure that we rely on is being adversely affected. Your correspondent earlier on was talking about problems in the roads and the railways. We know our health service is expecting to deal with a larger number of people with heat-related conditions at the moment, whilst working in building to work well in these sorts of temperatures. So there are lots of different dimensions of our lives that are being affected at the moment by the heat waves, and will continue to do so because we will continue to get more heat waves like this.
And how are governments reacting to this? Are they adapting their policies to deal with these kind of temperatures?
Well, there are two ways, effectively, that we can deal with climate change. One is to try and reduce emissions over the long term. That's not going to help this year or next year or in the next few years, although the sooner we reduce emissions, the better. In my view, progress on reducing emissions has stalled since the COP26 conference last year. Hopefully, the sort of events we're seeing this year will lead to a redoubling of effort to try and reduce emissions. But that's a long-term solution to the problem. The sooner we start, the better. Increasingly, governments are recognising and organisations are recognising that we need to adapt to changing conditions. What our infrastructure is designed to is now out of date. The temperatures are higher, the conditions are quite different, and they're going to change even more over the future in the next few decades. So there's quite a big increase in interest in governments and organisations in many countries, in the UK, in working out how best to adapt to climate change. There are a number of complications and problems with this. It's relatively straightforward to try and adapt things that we're building now. There are some technical challenges, but it's relatively straightforward. It's much more difficult to adapt things that already exist, like our rail network, like our hospitals, and so on. But the biggest challenge is possibly the responsibilities are spread across a load of different organisations and departments. It's not as if there's one organisation that says this is what needs to be done. It's a governance problem as well as a technical problem about how we adapt and alter our infrastructure and our services.
In a moment, my colleague Juliet Mann will be here with the agenda. In this week's show, after the worst start to the year since the Great Depression, what does the rest of 2022 hold for the world's financial markets? That's the agenda right after The World Today at 16:30 GMT here on CGTN. And that is The World Today. Thanks for watching. There's more news at the top of the hour. But for now, from all of the team here in London, goodbye.